Please be seated. My whole life, I have loved trees. I've loved climbing them. I've loved lying beneath the cool shade they produce. I've loved watching the wind blow through their branches. And while my love extends to all trees, there were two trees that I loved in particular. At my childhood home, there was an ancient apple tree in the backyard that encapsulated the freestanding treehouse that I spent many hours imagining in. And there was a tall oak in the front yard right by the road, where I spied on many cars passing by. These two trees formed the topography of my upbringing, and I knew every branch and every large crook where I could wedge myself so I could close my eyes and just rest on the strength of that tree. Even as I describe them to you, I can almost physically return to them. I can feel the bark with my toes and my fingers. I can smell the fragrance of that tree, and I can hear the swish of each tree's leaves blowing in the wind. In a way, these two trees were some of my best friends, and they were the settings both for my imaginary and very real development as a child. They were my teachers and my parents, creating the security and safety for me when I wanted to hide away, and also offering me scaffolding when I had the urge to challenge myself, to explore and climb ever higher. Each was so foundational to my life that I could never have imagined that there would someday come a day where both would cease to stand tall and nobly. I can't remember the exact sequencing of their respective demises. I do know that the apple tree had been losing branches in my teenage years, but I can't remember the exact day that it died. I do know that the oak did not find a natural ending. I remember feeling the shock as we drove home from a weekend away from college, and I could see, as we approached the house, the space where the tree used to be. It had been cut down by some utility workers who were maintaining the electrical lines. The grief that I experienced by their loss was not the earth-shaking kind. No, my life went on with little interruption, and I can often live many months and sometimes years without ever thinking about these two trees. But I cannot say that their loss went unnoticed. The ambiguous loss of these trees continues to impact me in subtle and frequently unnoted ways. Their departure from the world taught me that nothing in this world is permanent. It left me with that bittersweet feeling that time is short, and that the stability that we depend upon is imaginary. I realize this reflection on trees might sound like I'm stealing the plot of that famous Shel Silverstein's children's book, The Giving Tree. But really, it's today's readings that prompted this arboreal reflection. On this first Sunday of Advent, as we start a new liturgical year, we find ourselves beginning at the end. In today's readings, with all the references to the days are surely coming, or at that time, or in those days, we get a heavy dose of the world's impermanence. We hear from the prophet Jeremiah a statement of God's promise that in those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David. And from the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is speaking about the end of the world, telling us that there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and on the earth, distress among the nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the crashing of the waves, and that people will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world. While Episcopalians don't generally follow literalistic interpretations of the Bible, the imagery in this passage might just give us pause. As our planet gets hotter and tidal floods increase, aren't we already seeing the signs in the sun and in the moon? And after a devastating hurricane season with more deaths on record than any before, as we watch the waters rise and drive more and more climate refugees from their homelands, it's hard not to notice that the distress among the nations, confused by the roaring of the sea, is already upon us. Even if we don't assign eschatological significance to these crises, we are left still to wonder. If our faith cannot help us escape tribulations, then what exactly should we plan to do when we do face them? Jesus is speaking to his friends days before he enters into the apocalyptic period of his life, in both sense of that word. His crucifixion is an apocalypse in the common sense that we tend to know, the end of days. And his resurrection draws more literally on the Greek word apocalypsis, an uncovering or revealing that shows Jesus to be the very Son of God who overcomes death once and for all time. And because this canvas is too big for most of us to wrap our minds around, Jesus calls our attention to the trees, to those many trees which populate our lives, because we don't have very many fig trees around here, of course. He tells us to mark the time, to pay attention to what's really important, because the end of the world is always at hand for somebody or something that we love. Jesus is inviting us to attune our hearts to something different, because everything that we invest in to secure our safety or provide permanence will eventually crumble and tumble, including those two trees which provided me a safe place to grow and also to stretch and reach. Today's reflection on trees, particularly Jeremiah's reading, reminds me of a related Advent reading from the prophet Isaiah. He says, "A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out from his roots." This passage has always sparked my imagination. Usually when we see stumps, we think of one thing, but this text seems to suggest something more. Whenever I encounter the stump of an ancient tree, I stop in my tracks, and I always feel the need to pause to investigate. I usually scramble up and climb up on top, and for a moment, I embody that lost trunk of the tree. I stand tall, my spine erect, and I often extend my arms, perhaps giving that stump one last opportunity to stretch and to reach out into the world. It also reminds me to look down and inward. Whenever I take time to investigate that stump, I usually find some new growth emerging, a shoot coming out from the roots. Or if the stump's very, very old, perhaps I find some insect colony or some fungi or something finding life in the midst of death. The sight of a stump usually fills us with great sadness, a loss of life, but it's usually our limited sight that gets us stuck there. Stuck as we are inside time, we always imagine time in an ever-expanding plane, with the future emerging and the past retreating. But what if this notion of time is wrong? What if it's just our limited position within time that makes us think that that's the way it all is? The 12th century mystic and monk Meister Eckhart suggests that this time is what keeps the light from reaching us. There is no greater obstacle to God than time. And not only time, but temporalities. Not only temporal things, but temporal affections. And not only temporal affections, but the very taint and smell of time. He goes on to say, the most important hour is always the present. The most significant person is precisely the one sitting across from you right now. And the most necessary work is always love. So how can we change our relationship to life? To time. Jesus' words are not meant to describe the end of the world. No, not at all. They're designed to call our attention to the nature of time itself, to the present moment, to now. Too often we get caught up in the impossibility of the future or the loss of our past. We become frozen, like a stump stuck. We become bystanders. But that is not what the gospel tells us to do. Quite the contrary. Jesus says, now when these things begin to take place, stand up, raise your heads, maybe reach out your arms too. The message is clear. In times of crisis, we are called to humble ourselves so we might better look out for the welfare of others. As Jesus' disciples in this generation, we are the ones who must turn calamities into revelations of God's love for this world, a love so powerfully expressed by Jesus toward his friends, and now expressed with the same power by our care for one another. Recently, I heard Joan Baez, that 1960s era singer/songwriter, peace and civil rights activist who stood with Martin Luther King Jr., do an interview and reflect back on her life and her life's work. Now in her early 80s, she has a slightly different relationship to time, but no less urgent. She says, one of the things that was really important was to understand that we shall overcome didn't mean world peace forever. We shall overcome. Now, if we can still think of it as small victories, we can overcome this, and we can overcome that too. Because all we can do now is be here now. That's all we can do. We're all trying to find our way and how best to be heard or to make a dent or to do something empathetic and decent that doesn't get lost into the abyss. I just encourage people to keep trying that. The odds are just so enormously against us, which means you just have to try a little bit harder. One of the challenges of following Jesus' command to stand up and raise your heads is that we tend to get caught in time, frozen by our own anxieties, frozen by the enormity of it all. We humans get too caught in essentialistic thinking. Baez addresses this point. Well, the problem, she says, the problem with the word peace is that it's static. And the only way to even approach peace is through peace, through what you do. I remember my ex, David, saying, what you have at the end of the day is what you did that day. It doesn't matter really what you talk about. It's what you do. We follow a leader who didn't just say lots of things, who didn't just offer us nice moralistic renderings of the world, but stood tall, stretched out his arms in love for the whole world, and showed us what love looks like. All Jesus is telling us today is stop. Stop paying attention to those systems, those death-dealing ways, to all those ideas which promise security and prosperity that will continue forever, just automatically. They are false promises that are already crumbling. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away, he says. And those words, of course, were backed by actions, real loving actions. Constantly, he rolled up his sleeves to speak and act for justice. He allowed himself to be vulnerable in ways that fostered more love and showed that peace wasn't a static thing, but an ever-evolving, ever-renewing, constantly fought for reality. Jesus laid down his life in love. May we do the same, remembering the words of Meister Eckhart, that the most important hour is always the present. The most significant person is precisely the one sitting across from you right now. And the most necessary work is always love. Amen.